Thank you for letting me know. I'm starting from the beginning. Welcome everyone to the Journeys to the Books of the Prophets, the first book of Kings. The last few weeks we've been learning about King Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech. We went through his whole life, and last week it concluded with his death and burial and the consequences of what happened after his death. But tonight we're going to do something very similar to what we did after we learned the second book of Shmuel, which was almost exclusively about King David. And after we went through all of the stories of his life, different chapters, then we went back and tried to see the bigger picture. So tonight, we're going to do two things. There was a class that Rav Ginsburg gave, I'm not sure, 7-8 years ago, about Shlomo HaMelech. And I re-watched that video. If anyone wants, as a review of what we learned tonight, it's on YouTube. You just have to put in Rabbi Ginsburg King Solomon, and you'll get this video. It's an amazing teachings, and that's what we're going to do tonight. And part of it, I mentioned last week, is there is a very long, what's called a Gadata, the stories that are in the Talmud, a very long one. Rav Ginsburg says he thinks it's actually the longest about one particular incident. And we're going to learn that also. So strap your seatbelts and here we go. The way I'm going to do this, I'm going to give it over in the order that Rav Ginsburg gave it over. Not everything that he said I will have time to repeat, but if anyone watches it afterwards, you'll see I'm being very true to his teachings right now. So he began with an interesting overall comment that there were only 3 kings in all of Jewish history that ruled over all of Israel. And that's an amazing idea, amazing statement. But we started last week to see that one of the consequences of Shlomo HaMelech somewhat distancing his connection to God at the end of his life. I'm not going to go back over it, but the text is very clear that he was not whole with God as he was in the beginning. And as a consequence, obviously God was very upset. And it predicted in prophecy that the kingdom would be split. That split was, in a certain way, was never healed. The northern kingdom had 10 tribes. The southern kingdom had 2 tribes. And then the 10 tribes were taken away by the Assyrians in approximately 700 BCE. And as 10 tribes, we've never seen them again. They became mixed up with peoples. And there are certainly sparks of the 10 tribes quite literally all over the place. And many people, tribes, traditions account their lineage back to the 10 tribes. But the only 3 kings that ruled over all of Israel was Shaul, David, and Shlomo. That was it. After that, the kingdom split. And until this day, the closest thing we have is in the state of Israel. We have one state. We have lots of divisions, though. And that we discussed last week, that the idea of the tribes being divided in two kingdoms, the consequences are still felt today very, very strongly. But we have one political state, at least. So that was just a comment from Rav Ginsburg, which puts in perspective all of Jewish history. Shlomo comes from the word shalem or shalom. Shalem means complete, whole, perfect. Shalom, of course, means peace. So his name, we see that when he first started ruling, God was like 100% on his side. He was supporting him. He was encouraging him. And it even said that God loved Shlomo. And he called him by his special name, Yedidiah, which means the beloved of God. Yedid, and then the two letters of God's name, a Yud and a Hey, Yedidiah. God called Shlomo. And just like he loved David, he loved Shlomo. And when Shlomo turned away, so God comments that you turned away from me, not like your father. Now, David made mistakes in his life, but he always clung to God. He always loved God. God always loved David, even with all the mistakes. And we should understand that for ourselves also. We make mistakes all the time, but God loves us. But Shlomo turned away from God at the end. And it's quite puzzling, mysterious, and paradoxical. And hopefully we'll touch a little bit on how that happened. At the end of last week, when Shlomo dies and is buried, the text says that he ruled for 40 years. He died at the age of 52. It doesn't mention it in the text, but we know from tradition that he was 12 years old when he became king. When David passed away, he was 12 years old, and he ruled for 40 years. So he was 52 years old. Just a side comment, that's the exact age of Shmuel Hanavi, Shmuel the Shofet, the Chozeh. Samuel lived for 52 years, and so did Shlomo. But what's interesting that there are three major personalities in Jewish history that ruled for 40 years. So we just said Shlomo ruled for 40 years. David also ruled for 40 years, and it says it specifically in the text. And the other one who ruled for 40 years was Moshe. Moshe, in a certain way, was considered a king. It wasn't official. They weren't in Israel yet, and he wasn't anointed a king, but for all practical purposes, he acted like a king and he was accepted like a king. And he ruled for 40 years. So here you have Moshe, David, and Shlomo all ruling for 40 years. In the book of Kings, actually, it doesn't say this in the book of Kings, but the sages, when they want to talk about Shlomo, the book of Kings says Shlomo was the wisest person pretty much ever. And that was a gift from God. It wasn't just that he had a high IQ and he was very smart. It was a gift from God. If you remember the dream that he had where God came to him and said, whatever you request, I will give to you. And Shlomo asked for wisdom to judge the people properly. And so that's what God gave him. But he said, since you didn't ask for wealth and power and all of the trappings of wealth and power, I will give them to you as well. But in the Talmud, when they're referring to Shlomo, he's called HaChacham Mikol Adam, the wisest among all humans. HaChacham Mikol Adam. So Rav Ginsburg points out that the numerical value, the gematria of that phrase is 208. 208 equals the second patriarch, Yitzchak. Yitzchak equals 208. So what's the significance? What's the connection? On the surface, it's not obvious what the connection between Shlomo Melech and Yitzchak is. But Rav Ginsburg explains that Yitzchak is always associated with what's called the left side of the Sfirot. Avram was the right side, Yitzchak is the left side, and Yaakov is the middle, the unifying force. So what does it mean that Shlomo was HaChacham Mikol Adam, and that equals Yitzchak? So he explained Kabbalistically that what Shlomo was trying to accomplish was that the left side should be in ascendancy even over the right side. Now, usually we think of the right side as chesed, is mercy, is loving kindness, is water. Everything's flowing like water. And the left side is fire, gevura, might, discipline, law, judgment. So why did Shlomo want the left side to be in ascendancy? And here we're going to see this is part of why he failed. Because we're told that state of reality will only be revealed after the Mashiach comes. And one of the reasons is that the left side, the inner dimension of Gevura is always associated with Yitzchak, is Yira. Yira means, it's usually translated as fear, but it's not the fear that we think of being afraid of something. Yira means having the ultimate, utmost respect and love for the Creator, but in a state of awe, of true awe. And we have the statement, Reshit Chachma Yirat Hashem. The beginning of wisdom is the awe of God. But Chachma is on the right side, but Yira is on the left side. And so he explains that that's what Yitzchak stood for. He wanted to reveal this awesome awe in the world. That was his relationship with God. And Shlomo also wanted to reveal this state of awe, the state of the left side. But as we're going to see, he was not successful. Because it's something that it's meant for the future. And that's exactly what Shlomo wanted to do. We've mentioned this a number of times. And we'll mention it again here, that Shlomo's vision was totally messianic. He built the temple. People from all over the world came to hear his wisdom. He invited everyone in the world to come to the temple, and he married 1,000 wives from all of the nations with the idea of bringing them all under the wings of the Shekhinah. That was his vision. When we talk about Mashiach, it's Mashiach ben David. Well, that's Shlomo. Shlomo is the anointed king after David. That was his vision. But as we go further, we're going to see he was not able to pull it off. He was not able to pull it off. And one of the reasons is that if we compare him to Moshe, Moshe made mistakes. And mostly he made mistakes when he was in a state of anger. And especially when he hit the rock twice instead of speaking to it like God had told him, because he was in a state of anger. And because of that, God said, you can't come into Eretz Yisrael. That was a huge mistake, as it were, by Moshe. But it was a mistake. Mistakes can be fixed. Everything can be fixed. But Shlomo, his mistake was he was the wisest of all peoples. And he was the greatest judge. He gained the respect of all of Israel with the story that we went over. I'm not going to repeat it, of the two women who were claiming the same baby. And the way he was able to solve the case, the people were in such awe that they accepted Shlomo as king for 40 years. He was 12 years old when he did that judgment. And so for 40 years, he commanded the loyalty and the respect of the people. But his mistake was he didn't judge his own potential and his own character traits properly. And that was his downfall. If you remember, we learned that in the Torah it says that the king cannot multiply horses, wealth, and wives. And Shlomo did all of those. We learned specifically he had tens of thousands of horses and chariots. He had 1,000 wives. It's beyond our comprehension, really. And his wealth was world renowned. If you remember, the Queen of Sheba came and she was blown away by the wealth. She herself was extremely wealthy. And she brought all of these gifts of just everything, especially gold. And it was like nothing compared to anything she had seen. The wealth of not just Shlomo, the whole kingdom. And Shlomo said, I don't have to follow this halacha, because the rationale of the halacha is if you have too many horses, too much wealth, and too many wives, it will turn you away from God. And he said, I will not be turned away from God. I can pull this off. But we see that he didn't pull it off. The text makes it very, very clear that his wives turned his heart away and he allowed them to worship idols, and it corrupted everything that he had accomplished. And even though the text says as if he himself worshiped idols, that's how serious it was. The sages teach us he didn't worship idols, but he allowed his wives to worship idols, which introduced idol worship into the country. It was a terrible miscalculation. And so Shlomo, he could judge in wisdom everything except his own nature. And this is something we'll see further as we continue. The Arizal, in a Kabbalistic manner, and for those who were part of the Maaseh Merkavah, you'll remember that there's an idea that there's 4 levels of what I call klipot, forbidden shells. In other words, those things in the Torah that are forbidden is because we don't have the proper consciousness to approach them. We can't really deal with them. Just one example is, let's say, eating pork or any other non-kosher food. It's just off limits because we don't have the ability to really deal with the energy of these things. And then there are 3 what are called klipot that are off limits. But then there's a klipa called klipa noga. That is a klipa that is a mixture of good and evil, permitted and not permitted. And we're told that most of the work that we do in life is involved in this klipa noga. Let's say we're following the Torah, so we push away these 3 shells, these 3 klipot. But in the area of klipa noga, it can go either way. A lot of it depends on how we deal with things. And so the Arizal said that Shlomo's what he wanted to accomplish was he wanted to try to clarify this whole area called klipa noga. And if he could have been successful, then all of the other klipot in a certain way would have fallen away, and we would enter into the Messianic era. But again, he misjudged his own ego, his own characteristics, that he thought nothing will deter him, nothing will turn him away. But it wasn't true. So that's what the Arizal says, a very important idea here. Then Rav Ginsburg points out something very, very interesting, almost an obvious question. He was married to 1,000 wives, and we talked about just the practicality of intimacy with 1,000 women. There's only 365 days in the year. Like, how did that work? And so we entertained the idea that maybe he didn't have intimate relations with many of these women. He married them more for what we call political reasons, or part of his vision. But the text itself says that he loved them, which we understand that he had relations with them. And so Rav Ginsburg just brings up almost an obvious question. If you look in the story, where are his children? From 1,000 wives, you would think that he would have quite literally thousands of children. And yet, there's only 3 children mentioned. And in fact, only one is mentioned explicitly. And that is his son, Rechavam, who we began to learn about, and we will continue next week. Rechavam became the next king. And he had 2 daughters, and it's only mentioned that the land was divided into areas and by the months of the year. And he had representatives that were in charge each month to make sure everything in the kingdom was going properly. Two of them that are mentioned are the husbands of two of his daughters. And their names, according to tradition, one is Bosmat, and the other one is Tophat. That's the names. So it's I don't know what the word is. It's just very interesting that either the text and tradition kind of like passes over the idea of children from these 1,000 wives. It's a little bit mysterious. So, but we'll see later the connection with three of the wives that we'll get to. Okay, now here we are going to introduce the story in the Talmud. So first of all, there is a tradition that Shlomo fell 5 levels. That at the height of his, call it, spiritual powers, he ruled over the upper worlds and the lower worlds. His first fall was he lost being in control of the upper worlds. And that we'll get to in this story. He only had power over the lower worlds. Then he fell again, and he only had power over Israel. He fell again, and his power was reduced to Yerushalayim. He fell again. His only power was his bed. And here we're not talking in a sexual manner. It's just he lost his control. He only controlled where he lay down. And his last fall, there's a disagreement. One says he only controlled the shirt on his back, and the other one says only his staff. So in other words, Shlomo, from the heights of his wisdom, his power, he fell to had only the shirt on his back or the staff in his hand. So this is connected to this story. And the source of where the story comes from is in the book of Kohelet, in the 8th verse of the 1st chapter. And it says, wait, excuse me. 1 second. One second. I'm sorry, it's the 12th verse of the 1st chapter. It says, Ani Kohelet. First of all, this is from the book of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes in Hebrew is called Kohelet. So it says, Ani Kohelet, Hayiti Melech al Yisrael b'Yerushalayim. I am Kohelet, and as the author of this book, which is Shlomo, says, and the book begins, Divrei Kohelet ben David, Melech b'Yerushalayim. These are the words of Kohelet. In other words, that's another name for Shlomo. He himself names himself Kohelet. It comes from the word kahal, which means a congregation or a gathering of people. A kihila is a congregation, a gathering of people. So Divrei Kohelet, in other words, he is meaning that these words are for all of the people. He's gathering the people together to give over this wisdom in the book of Kohelet. And it starts, these are the words of Kohelet, the son of David, the king in Jerusalem. That's how it starts. But in the 12th verse, just notice a very subtle difference here. It says, Ani Kohelet, Hayiti Melech al Yisrael b'Yerushalayim. I am Kohelet. I ruled in the past. I ruled over Israel in Jerusalem. So this gave, call it fuel to the question, what does it mean? I ruled once. He's talking in the present. Why is he saying I ruled in Jerusalem? So from that comes this very, very unique Gemara. There's no way we can go over all of the details. I'm going to try to give the general idea. Anyone who wants to look it up, you can go to Sefaria. It's in the tractate of Gittin, 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 and it's page 68a. And it continues for an entire page, which doesn't sound like a lot, but in the Gemara, an entire page, that is a lot. It goes more than a page. It goes, yeah. So the story is like this. And it's based on a verse. Now, first of all, what does it mean that Shlomo ruled over the upper worlds? So that means that he understood the realm of angels, but also of what we're going to call demons, negative forces. They're also created by God. Everything is created by God. Satan is an angel of God. The angel of death is an angel of God. Everything comes from God. Evil doesn't come from God, but the possibility of evil does come from God, and that allows us to have free choice. So it begins with a verse. This is from, one second. This is from the second chapter of Ecclesiastes. And Shlomo says, Asiti li sharim v'sharot v'ta'anugot b'nei ha'adam shida v'shidot. Shlomo says, I provided myself with male and female singers and music with the lights of mankind. Now, this is a deep understanding of music. He calls them the lights of mankind. And then it says, and with Shida and Shidot. So the Gemara asks, what is a Shida and what is a Shidot? One is in the masculine, one's in the feminine. And the Gemara says, these are male and female demons. That Shlomo is ruling over the upper worlds and the lower worlds, the angels and the demons. The whole world is coming to Shlomo. He's ruling over everything. So the question is, why does he need demons? What is he doing with demons? And again, I'm not going every detail. And so one second. Okay, so it says that why did Shlomo need demons? Is because when he was building the temple, and we discuss this, there was this idea that there should be no metal instruments used in constructing the temple. And this is somewhat questionable because in the Torah, the only thing that it specifically says that you should not use metal instruments is making the altar, which is just one part of the temple. Yet, as happens many times in Jewish tradition, things are expanded to include things that are similar. And we learned that in the text, it says specifically that no metal instruments were heard in the actual site of building the temple, on the Temple Mount. But it doesn't imply that getting the stones which were quarried, they also did it without metal instruments. Now, anyone who looks at the Kotel and you see these huge rectangle mammoth stones, well, how did they quarry them without metal instruments? So the Gemara says that this was Shlomo's dilemma, but he knew that there was I'll call it a being, a spiritual being that was called the Shamir. And according to tradition, it was a worm. Now, again, we're really not talking about a physical worm. And I have to say, this whole story is understood by all the commentaries as being metaphoric and allegorical. And we'll discuss that at the end. So Shlomo has to get his hands on this Shamir. But the Shamir is in the hands of the demons. And so Shlomo, he says, well, where am I going to find the Shamir? They say, well, if you can get your hands on a male and a female demon, and you can force them to tell you where the king of the demons, called Ashmedai, he becomes the main figure here, where Ashmedai hangs out. He knows where the Shamir is, and you have to get it from him. And so Shlomo, again, according to the story, sends Benayahu ben Yehoyada. He's someone we've discussed already. He was a very, very important person in David's kingdom. And he became the head of the army for Shlomo. And he was also the head of the Sanhedrin. So he wasn't just a warrior, he was also the wisest of the wise. So he sends him and he gives him a chain that had a name of God on it and a signet ring that had a name of God in it. And this is part of the tradition that this signet ring was either had a 6-pointed star or a 5-pointed star. Either what we call Magen David, the Star of David, or the Star of Shlomo, which is a 5-pointed star. So he sends Benayahu ben Yehoyada to capture Ashmedai. And here I'm going to skip over a lot of details of how Benayahu plots to capture Ashmedai, which he does. And he brings him back to Shlomo. And then, again, there's all these like adventures in between, all highly symbolic, metaphorical, allegorical. Now, Ashmedai, he is captured. and he's finally brought to Shlomo HaMelech. And Shlomo says, Ashmedai says, it's not enough that you rule over the upper worlds and the lower worlds. You had to capture me as well. So Shlomo explained to him, I captured you because I need to know where this Shamir is. And Ashmedai says, the truth is, I don't control the Shamir. The master of the sea controls the Shamir, and he put the Shamir in the hands of the wild cock. So if you can capture the wild cock, then you could get the Shamir. And so Benyahu Ben Yehoyada, he succeeds in getting the Shamir. He brings it back, and now Shlomo has the Shamir. So it says that one day Ashmedai is with Shlomo, and Shlomo asks him, why do you think you're superior, or in what way do you think you're superior to human beings? So Ashmedai says, well, in the position I am now, I'm captured, I have this chain over me. If you'll take the chain off and give me the signet ring that helped capture me, I'll show you how I'm more superior than you. And Shlomo mysteriously does so. He lets him go. He gives him the signet ring. And what it says afterwards is quite literally that Ashmedai swallowed him. He swallowed up Shlomo. What happened? What does that mean? So the story continues that he cast Shlomo like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of kilometers away, 400 parsang. We're told that the measurements of the land of Israel are 400 by 400 parsang. So he cast him out of Israel, and he impersonated him and sat on his throne. It's a wild story, this whole thing. I mean, and the parts that I've left out are even wilder. Okay, so he is sitting on the throne now. He's an imposter. And Shlomo literally has the shirt on his back and his staff. He has fallen completely. The 5 levels, he has fallen. And he went around saying to people, Ani Kohelet, Hayiti Melech al Yisrael Yerushalayim. The same verse that we read. I am Kohelet. I used to rule over Israel and Jerusalem. Now, everyone thought he was crazy. He has no money. He has just a shirt on his back and his staff. He's in exile. So, of course, no one believes him. But he keeps on saying, everywhere he went, he says the same thing over and over again. Ani Kohelet Hayiti Melech al Yisrael b'Yerushalayim. I was king. So this was reported back to the rabbis of the Sanhedrin, that there's someone claiming to be Shlomo HaMelech. And so, of course, the rabbis of the Sanhedrin are very smart, and they said, usually someone who is crazy, they don't repeat the same thing over and over again. They have all kinds of imaginations, all kinds of stories. But this person is repeating the same thing over and over again. So they decide to investigate. So they go to Benyahu, Ben Yehoyada, who was the closest advisor to Shlomo Melech. And they ask him, has Shlomo come to you recently? And he said, no, actually, he hasn't come to me in the longest of time. And so the rabbis are a little bit suspicious here. So then they go to his wives and they say, does Shlomo visit you? And they say, yes, he visits all of us. And then they said to them, the next time he visits, look at his feet, because demons they can impersonate human beings, but not their feet. Their feet are more like an animal's feet, like a chicken or a rooster. And so they came back to the wives and they said, we can't tell. He's always wearing socks. He's always wearing stockings. We can't see his feet. And then they asked, when does he solicit you? And they said, well, strangely enough, even when we're in nida, even when it's not appropriate to have relations, he comes to us. So now the rabbis knew there's something really wrong here, something really, really wrong here. And so they go and they bring Shlomo and they give him a chain with God's name on it and a different signet ring that was like the one he had, that had the name of God on it. And Shlomo goes into the palace, into the throne room, and as soon as Ashmedai sees him, he flees because he knows the gig is up. The gig is up. I'm finished. And he escapes. So the story ends like this, that even though Ashmedai leaves, it says that for the rest of his life, Shlomo was in terror of Ashmedai coming back. And how do we know this? Because there's a verse in the Song of Songs that says, behold, Shlomo's bed is surrounded by 60 mighty warriors, and they all are skilled with the sword. Each man has a sword on his thigh because of terror in the nights. That Shlomo was in terror at night, so he had to have 60 warriors surrounding his bed to make sure that Ashmedai did not come back. And the end of the story is there's a disagreement between Rav and Shmuel. Rav and Shmuel are two of the greatest sages in Babylonia. One of them says Shlomo was king and afterwards became a commoner. He never fully regained his crown. Even when he came back after this whole story, he was king, but he wasn't the same person. And the other one says he was king, and then he was a commoner, and then he was a king again. And that's the end of the story. Now, everyone understands all of the commentaries through the ages, not only this story. We have to understand that the Talmud tells many, 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 we'll call it wild, sometimes they're called exaggeration tales. And they're understood that the sages were wanting to give over certain messages, but didn't want to do it in a direct manner. So they hid what they're saying in metaphor, symbolic language. And so here, the question at the end between Rav and Shmuel is, did he ever return? Did he ever recover? So Rav Ginsburg says the following, based on many of the commentaries that try to figure out the symbolism of this story. And so the bottom line here is that it's understood that Ashmedai is part of Shlomo. That Shlomo had what's called a side of light and a side of darkness. And this is very, very important because it gives us a broader perspective of, in a certain way, what was right about Shlomo's life and what went wrong. Because again, it's almost jarring that someone of this wisdom that had God's love and support and had literally the entire world eating out of his hand could what's called go off the path. And at the end of his life, he wasn't the same person. And because of that, the kingdom was divided. One of the most traumatic experiences in all of Jewish history. And as I said, he was the last king that ruled over all of Israel. And to this day, that division has not been totally healed. So here we see Shlomo was the highest of the high. In potential, he ruled the upper worlds and the lower worlds. And we're told that his wisdom was beyond anything that we can imagine, that he could speak to the animals, he spoke to the trees, he spoke to angels, he spoke to demons, he understood them, and he ruled over them. And in the end, he only ruled over his bed, and even his bed, he was full of terror. So here we see one of the most dramatic downfalls in Jewish history. So Rav Ginsburg points out an amazing thing. He says that if you take the word light and darkness, wait one second, or and choshech, and you add them together, it equals Kohelet. It equals exactly Kohelet. And we know that Shlomo Melech wrote 3 books, Shir HaShirim, Mishlei, and Kohelet, the Song of Songs, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. What's interesting is 2 of the 3 books almost did not make it into the Tanakh, almost didn't make it into the Bible. What was the problem? The Song of Songs. Now remember, Shlomo wrote the book of Proverbs, which to this day is one of the greatest literary achievements, the book of Proverbs. The Song of Songs is a proverb. It's a metaphor. It's an allegory of the love between God and Israel, but it's clothed in a love story between a man and a woman. And so the rabbis debated if people don't understand the metaphor, what is a love story doing in the Bible? But Rebbe Akiva came and said all of the books of the Tanakh are holy, but the Song of Songs is the holy of holiest. And on his opinion, his weight, obviously he wasn't alone, but he understood that this allegory is sublime. The Song of Songs is it's one of the 10 archetypal songs sung through all of history, but it almost didn't make it into the Tanakh. And then the book of Ecclesiastes, Kohelet, it's a very philosophical book. Some call it a very pessimistic book. Some of it seems to border on ideas that are not usually accepted. And there was a great debate whether this book should be included. But this is just indicative of the Song of Songs is like the highest of the high. But Ecclesiastes is kind of like the lowest of the low. And that's why the sages were not sure that they wanted this kind of almost existential pessimism to be readily studied. Nonetheless, they saw the great wisdom in the book of Kohelet, and they included it. But this is indicative of the two sides of Shlomo, light and darkness. He had what's called a side of light and purity and vision and clinging to God. And he had a dark side that he thought he could control, but in the end, he couldn't control it. And so many people who take the story of Shlomo and Ashmedai, they consider it like a battle within Shlomo himself. And the whole idea that Ashmedai took over his throne, took over the kingdom, is indicative of how slowly, as the story of Shlomo develops, he fell from the side of light, and he ended up more or less being ruled over by his darker side. And so that's the whole inner meaning here. The whole inner meaning. We're not going into all the details of the different symbolism, but the story in general is the fall of Shlomo into the side of darkness. Now, Rav Ginsburg then says something very, very important. In fact, this particular class, I think I've mentioned this before, is that this was part of a series of classes that Rav Ginsburg gave in English once a month in Jerusalem around, I don't remember exactly, 7, 8, 9 years ago. And I was the MC of this event. It was watched worldwide. And at the end, there were questions, and Rav Ginsburg would answer them. So I asked the following question, is that, and then Rav Ginsburg elaborated, is that all of the figures in the Torah are what's called archetypal. Avram, Yitzhak, Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah, all of the stories are the real stories, but they clothe much deeper ideas than single events that happen to one person. For example, in this week's Parsha is the wrestling match between Yaakov and the man, the angel, Esav himself, God. This story reverberates until this day. It is archetypal, and its energy manifests in every generation and every person. This whole battle that Yaakov fought. But the same thing with this story. So I asked a question, and I said that the side of light of Shlomo is called the Yetzer HaTov, the good inclination. And the dark side is what's called the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination. And so in a certain way, my question was, can we see that Shlomo, more than perhaps any other figure in the entire Tanakh, represents the archetypal form of every person? Because every person has a Yetzer HaTov and a Yetzer Hara, has a side of light and a side of darkness. For some people, it's 99% light and 1% dark. Other people, it's the opposite, 99% dark and 1% light. Most of us are somewhere in the middle, and it just changes by the hour because we're always being tempted. We're always being tested. We're always being challenged. And this is the story of life between these two forces. And so Rav Ginsburg said, absolutely, that this whole story of Ashmedai and Shlomo is an inner battle that every person plays with themselves, acts it out on sometimes a moment-to-moment level of making decisions. Do I follow this inclination or do I follow that inclination? Do I think that I have control of this inclination? Or perhaps I think I do, but I really don't. And so that is really the story in the Gemara. So just a few last things is that there is a verse in the Song of Songs that says like this. It is the 8th verse of the 7th chapter. Chapter 7, the 8th verse, it says, Ma yafit uma na'amt ahava b'tanugim. How beautiful and how pleasant is love of delights. So there's really 3 parts of this verse: beauty, pleasure, and delight. So Rav Ginsburg says an amazing thing is, of all of the 1,000 wives of Shlomo Melech, there are 3 that stand out. The first one is really the most problematic, and that's the daughter of Pharaoh. If you remember, it's the first wife that he marries, and she's the daughter of Pharaoh. And she's mentioned over and over in the text. He builds an enormous palace for her. She's named many, many times. And according to tradition, his downfall begins really early in his life because he married her on the very day that the temple was inaugurated. And this, more than anything, points out on the same day that he inaugurates the temple, which was to be a dwelling place for God in this world, for the Shekhinah. And for a time, it actually succeeded to do that. But on the same day, he married the daughter of Pharaoh, and that began his downfall. The Midrash says, when he married Pharaoh, a reed was planted where Rome would be built. In other words, his downfall wasn't just a personal downfall. And as we said, his downfall led to the division of the kingdom. But not only that, it led to Rome, the fourth exile. So her beauty, as Leonard Cohen would say, overwhelmed him. So she's the first in this verse. The love, how beautiful. The second one is how pleasant, and that is his very, very holy wife, Naamah. Naamah was from Ammon, and according to tradition, when the two daughters of Lot, who thought that the world was about to end after the catastrophe in Sodom, and they sleep with their father, incest, but they did it because they thought this is the only way to have the continuation of humanity. And from that comes the nation of Moab and the nation of Ammon. From Moab comes Ruth. From Ammon comes Naamah. And they're both considered very, very, very holy. And that was the side of light of Shlomo. This, of all of his wives, she was from the side of light. And the last one is Ahava B'tanugim, love of delights. And that was the Queen of Sheba. And it actually says in the text, she was so taken by Shlomo Melech, it says that whatever she desired, Shlomo gave it to her. And it's explained, and we discussed this, her desire was to have children by him. She wanted a child from Shlomo Melech. And according to tradition, she did have either one or two children. But according to tradition, Nebuchadnezzar, the one who destroys the temple, comes from that child that Shlomo and the daughter of, and the Queen of Sheba had. So this, again, it's so paradoxical. Again, it shows the light side and the dark side of Shlomo. And so he gives birth to the very person in the lineage who is going to destroy the temple. And also the Arizal says that what was the name of the daughter of Pharaoh? It doesn't mention in the text. And so the Arizal says her name was Batya. Now this is very interesting because according to tradition, there was another daughter of Pharaoh. That was the daughter who saved Moshe, who found him in a little basket and ends up raising him in the palace of Pharaoh. But according to Jewish tradition, she was a very, very holy soul, but she also had a dark side. And that's this theme running through this. And everyone has a Yetzer Tov and a Yetzer Ra. And so the daughter of Pharaoh who brought up Moshe, according to tradition, she came out of Egypt with Israel. And in the mystic tradition, it's said that she has, in the upper world, she has like a palace. Her soul is considered so lofty. But she also had another side. And that side reincarnated into this daughter of Pharaoh, who in a certain way, turned Shlomo away from the straight path. So these are amazing ideas from the Arizal. And Rav Ginsburg also quotes from the Ari, going back to Na'amah, that even though she and Shlomo had a son, that was Rechavam, he became the next king. And in theory, he could have been a great king. But tune in next week, we'll learn the big mistake that he made. Huge mistake. Still reverberating through all of Jewish history. But in principle, he could have been a very, very high soul. And we know that from Ruth, remember these are the two nations that come from the daughters of Lot, that Ruth becomes the great-great-grandmother of David HaMelech. So the Arizal says explicitly that the soul of Mashiach will come through converts. Because Rechavam, that continued the line, even though we lost the kingdom, but the lineage of David leading all the way to Mashiach comes from David, Shlomo, Rechavam. And Rechavam comes from Na'amah. And so this is just a very, very deep idea. And there's another idea that Rav Ginsburg emphasizes, that Mashiach will also be a Baal Tshuva. Just like in a certain way, David was a Baal Tshuva, and David comes from Yehuda. Yehuda, in a certain way, was the first Baal Tshuva. What happened with Tamar? And he admits it. And so here we see that the soul of Mashiach will come through the lineage of converts and through a lineage of returnees, Baal Tshuva. Very, very important ideas here. Okay, I think we did justice to Rav Ginsburg's teachings, did justice to the Talmudic story. Again, anyone who wants to follow up on this, so first of all, go to the tractate in Gittin, 68 A and B, and you can see on YouTube this class that I'm quoting from. I didn't quote everything. There are many other really deep ideas, but we got the main ones. So with this, in a certain way, we have finished the life of Shlomo Melech, and we will be continuing.